hello to those of you who are here, and we're expecting more people to join. And welcome to the webinar on what is it's this weekend, the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. So this is the second year that we've had this webinar. We're really excited to welcome 3 more brilliant women working in science to talk to us today. My name is Jo, I'm the director of IRIS. My background is that I did a PhD in woodland ecology, a PhD with what was then the Ministry of Agriculture. I was really lucky to get into research at a fairly young age, and then realised quite soon after my PhD that I wanted to be a teacher. So then I was a teacher for 20 years, and then I discovered IRIS, and now I'm the director of IRIS. I'm really privileged to be able to work with young people all across the country, helping them to do real research in schools. And what we find is that when students get involved in real research, they often get the research bug, and they find that they'd really like to go into a career in science. So what we are going to be doing today is talking to these 3 fabulous women who are involved in science about their route into a science career, things that they would recommend, things they wish they'd known, and just going to find a little bit more out about how they got into science and what they do now. So I'm going to go around the group and allow each of the scientists to introduce themselves. So if it's okay, I will start with you, Yvonne, please.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Dr. Yvonne Nayathi. I am a lecturer at the University of Bradford. I lecture biochemistry, and my research, currently I'm looking at proteins. So proteins make up our bodies, and without proteins, we don't exist. So what I'm looking at the moment is trying to find out why they clump together. So in diseases, neurodegeneration, where there are problems in the transmission of messages to the brain, one thing that is found when these people die is that they have got clumps in their brain where the proteins are all tangled and clumped. So my research is trying to understand why these proteins clump and what we can do to stop this clumping, because with that we can find a cure for these diseases. So currently in the UK, we have over 850,000 people who have dementia, and it's mainly because of this clumping of the proteins. So my research is focusing on that, in addition to teaching students about biochemistry. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I'm probably going to ask you some more questions about your research in a little while, if that's okay. That's really interesting. So I imagine, do you also have students who you're supervising as well as students that you're teaching?
Yeah, so for supervision, I've got students at all different levels. I've got, I start with supervision of summer students, just starting from those who come in from secondary schools. I had last summer 4 students coming in to do research, and they were coming from via the schools to come in and do summer placements. In addition, then I have got project students who are doing their first degree, and then I also have master's students. So currently I've got 4 master's students. In the lab at the moment, I've got 5 undergraduate students, and I've got 4 PhD students and 2 postdocs who have already done PhD and are doing their research beyond. So I have quite a big group of students to supervise at all different levels.
Wow. Okay, so I also may talk a little bit about that later to explain kind of how that supervision, sort of how it works and how that's really helpful for students to learn how they sort of carry out research and how to improve as researchers. So thank you very much. I'm going to go next to Emily. Emily, if you could just introduce yourself and what you're doing at the moment, please.
Sure. So I'm a 3rd-year PhD student at the University of Leeds, and my research focuses on methane in our atmosphere. It's a greenhouse gas, which means it contributes to global warming, and it's a very important chemical in our atmosphere. And I use satellites and computer models to investigate the global trends of methane, so how methane is changing in our atmosphere across the globe. So these computer models are very important and very useful tools which we can use to simulate methane in the atmosphere and see how it's changing. Yeah, it's a very interesting topic because we don't fully understand how methane is changing and what is driving these changes in our atmosphere. And I think satellites are really key into helping us understand that. So yeah, it's a very exciting topic.
Brilliant, thank you, Emily. And I know that some of the students who are watching are taking part in our Earth observation project, where they use data from the Sentinel satellite and use that satellite imagery in many different ways. I should have said at the very start, but I forgot. So I'm saying now, if any of the attendees or students watching, so I know a lot of the attendees will be teachers with classes of students or groups of students. If you have any questions, please do type them into the box and we will come to them either during the session or towards the end. So just type your questions into the box. If they're questions generally that you'd like everyone to answer, or if they're questions specifically to one of the panelists, then just pop them in the box and we will have a look at them later on. Great, thank you very much, Emily. Emily, did you say third year?
Yes, I'm in my third year.
Okay, so third year of your PhD means you're writing up, are you?
Not quite. So my PhD is funded for 3 years and 9 months. So I'm currently on an industrial placement with the Met Office. So I'm taking a short break from my PhD work to do another project. But
Great.
Yeah,
thank you.
Still very busy.
Yes, yeah. So for those watching, just to sort of explain, because I certainly didn't know about this until I started doing a PhD. Essentially, when you do a PhD, you it's usually about 3 years. Although it sounds as though, Emily, yours 3 years, 9 months funded, which is really great because you've got some writing up time. But generally, you spend the 3 years doing the piece of research. So in our projects, as those of you watching will know, there's this background study where you start off learning about it. That's how a PhD starts too. You have to spend quite a few months just learning about the content and the very specific thing you're looking at. Then there's the research where you're actually looking at it and trying to find something out. And then there's the writing up, which in an IRIS project is the equivalent of when you write your poster or your presentation. In a PhD, you have to basically write a book. I'm right, aren't I, Emily? And that's the bit where you really have to be very resilient to kind of get through it. Yvonne, I'm sure that some of your supervisees are ploughing through their dissertations or their thesis now, but that write-up period is so critical because that's when you share what you found with other people, and that's where you can sort of push forward the sort of boundaries of science. Brilliant, thanks, Emily. Kat, please.
Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Kat Hickey. My background is in volcanology, so I also did a PhD. Mine actually took longer because I did it in Canada and the system there is very different. So I spent 5 years on my PhD writing that book. That was really interesting, and I looked at a specific type of earthquake that happens on volcanoes. However, since then I have moved out of the sort of basic academic research, and I'm now a senior consultant for a company called Space Tech Partners. It's a consultancy company. We focus on the space sector. So we just look at projects that have to do with space. There could be satellites, and Joe and Emily were both mentioning satellites already, actually thinking about the Sentinel satellites, thinking about Earth observation. So essentially, as a consultant, you're not really classed as a researcher, but you use all of your research skills. You have different projects, sometimes some only last for a few weeks or a few months, and you really do a lot of work like you would be doing in research to understand more about a topic and then to advise a company or a government or some organization about a particular thing that you're researching. So, for example, we work a lot with the European Commission. The European Commission are essentially the EU body who are in charge of the Sentinel satellites. And we work with them on what's called the Copernicus Support Office. So we do a lot of the communications, a lot of the stuff on Twitter or on other social media that you will see about Copernicus comes from our company because we run that Copernicus Support Office on behalf of the European Commission. But we also do lots of other things. So it's not just about communications, it's about We work with companies who maybe want to develop a particular space sector product. We work with governments to develop their space strategies or space policies. It's so broad, really, really varied, really interesting, because I can use my geosciences background, but also some experience I got in the space sector at a satellite Earth station in Cornwall, where I live, called Goonhilly Earth Station, and I worked there for 5 years. So I'm combining all of that with the things I know about how to do research, and every week I get to work on different tasks. So for me, it suits me really well, and it's a slightly different way of being a researcher compared to if you were at a university or in a sort of research institution.
Thank you, Kat. And I think it's really interesting that you've referenced several times in there the skills that you learned through research. You know, the research, I love doing research. I love doing it for its own sake, but I recognise that the things that I learned, for example, doing my PhD, I use all the time. You know, the critical thinking skills, the problem solving, the recognising that actually very rarely does one person or one academic area have the answer. You have to bring in ideas from lots of different areas to answer a question, and I think that's one of the things that sometimes students are a bit surprised about. You know, they find that their science, you know, they're more excited about science and their science results improve and they're, you know, enjoying it more, but they also find that they're pulling in ideas from computer science and maths and from design technology, and we've even had students, art students, working on some of our projects because it really sort of fires their imagination. So yes, that's really useful perspective to have somebody who's working in a sort of more commercial area talking about how that impacts on you know, what they've learned and what they do. So that's great, thank you. So so we've got a PhD student working in looking at methane. We've got a doctor at a university working on dementia and plaques in the brain, am I right?
Yeah.
Alzheimer's, plaques,
Yeah.
protein folding.
Yeah.
And Kat working commercially on sort of consulting about lots of different projects, but with a background in volcanology. And I'm fascinated, I don't know if we'll have time, but earthquakes on volcanoes sounds like double exciting. So yeah, hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about that later. So first of all, so a question for each of you, and I'm going to start with Yvonne, if that's okay. What led you into this field? So how did you end up where you are now? What sort of pathway did you take as you came into, like, how did you end up where you are now?
So at a young age, when I grew up, I thought I was going to do medicine. That's what I wanted to do. I was just fascinated by seeing doctors with all their lab coats and the stethoscopes and everything. It just fascinated me. And I wanted to do that. But when I moved into high school, I realized when I was in the lab, I just felt I belonged there. It was just like an instant realization that this is what I want to do. I want to be a scientist. I want to work in the lab. So then after my high school, I moved on to do my degree in biochemistry. And then after that, I did the master's more in like another arm of biochemistry, but more looking at how the bugs infect the cells. And then after that, I did the PhD at Leeds. And then after doing my PhD, I did 3 years working in Manchester, doing more research before I took up a job as a lecturer. So yeah, it was very much more like love at first sight. When I went in the lab, I was just like, this is it. I like to be working in the lab. And I just followed that path of doing a degree and then doing a further research until I'm doing what I'm doing now.
Great, thank you so much. I've written a few sort of key points there that I want to come back to later, but I'm going to hear first, if it's okay, from Emily.
Yeah, so when I was growing up, I really wanted to be a weather forecaster, so meteorologist. And yeah, throughout school, I studied really hard, doing like sciences, so like physics, maths, are two key subjects for being a meteorologist, and geography as well. And so I was like really driven towards that that goal. So I ended up going to Edinburgh University to do a degree in physics with meteorology, where I spent 5 years there doing a master's, like an integrated master's. But in my final year, I ended up doing a project in atmospheric methane. So this is kind of the first time that I'd really looked at greenhouse gases, and particularly methane, and found it really interesting, and also found it interesting that we didn't know that much about it, despite having measured it for quite a long time at surface observation sites across the world. So that was a really great project, but I still wanted to be a meteorologist. So after I graduated, I was really lucky and got a job as a offshore weather forecaster up in Aberdeen. And so it was really great. I managed to like reach my goal of being a forecaster like as soon as I came out of uni. And I learned a lot of skills in that job, but I kind of realized I wanted to be doing more teamwork and more research, and kind of project-based work was really something that I was more interested in. So I started looking for like PhD roles, and the one at Leeds came up in methane, and I just sounded great. So I applied for that, and that's how I ended up at Leeds Uni. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Emily. And I just want to say, I know we talked a little bit about what supervision is, but I just want to explain, just in case anyone hasn't come across it before, what a PhD is and how it works. So at least how it worked. Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, and Yvonne actually. In fact, all of you, if I'm wrong now and I'm out of date. But basically, generally what happens is somebody goes to university and does a degree. Actually now you can also do a degree level apprenticeship, so you can go through that route as well. After you've done your degree, you can either sort of leave, go and get a job, go into work, or you can stay or go somewhere else and do an extra year doing a master's, or sometimes 2 years. So it's a sort of higher level qualification, or you can go straight on if you know that you love research and you really want to, and you can start looking around for a PhD, which is a doctorate, where you basically spend another 3 or 4 years studying something you're particularly interested in. So a big piece of research, like a mega research project, and hopefully one where you find out something new. And at the end of that, you then have the choice to go into all sorts of different directions too. So when we're talking about a PhD, it's sort of an extra sort of degree that you can do after you've done your first one. And you can do as Emily did, a degree and then a master's and then a PhD, or you can do a degree and then a master's and not a PhD, or you can do a degree and then a PhD, or an apprenticeship, or whatever. But there's lots of different ways in, but when we're talking about a PhD, it's kind of an extra piece of research that you might do after you finished university. And that's where some people find that they can really specialize in something they're really fascinated by. So Emily, you found a particular area of weather you're very interested in, and that's something that you want to look at. Great, thank you very much, Emily. And Kat, how did you end up where you are? You've given us a little bit of detail, but if we could have a little bit more, that'd be great. And I'm particularly interested in your work to do with volcanoes.
Yeah, so my path was really wondrous. It wasn't a straight line at all, but I think actually maybe for some of you being in school today, it's going to be very similar, because we don't live in a time anymore where you study to be something and then you have a job and you have that job for 40 years and then you retire. But lots of us will do one thing for a little bit and then another thing and then another thing. And so for me, I started out like that. I always just did what felt right at the time. And that way I never had to look back and think, oh, I've made the wrong decision or I should have done it differently. But I knew at the time things were really right. And I didn't set out to be in the space sector. It just happened, but I love it. And I've always enjoyed science. I've always enjoyed sort of physics, maths, and geography as well. And I grew up in Germany, and there you have to do a thesis at the end of high school, at the end of towards the end of your A levels. And my thesis was actually on the sun, and I was imaging the sun and sort of measuring sunspots and the brightness and just different phenomena that we can see. And then again, in Germany, you sort of get handed a book at the end of high school, and it has all the things that you can study and lists all the universities. And I was just sort of flicking around in it, and I read about geophysics, and I thought, oh, I've never heard of geophysics. I don't really know what that is. And it sounded really interesting. So I contacted a professor at the university in Munich, which was near where I lived, who was in geophysics. And he said, oh, why don't you come and visit, and we can explain things to you and you can have a look around. And so I did that, and I really liked it. And I spoke to some students, and I thought, great, this is what I'll do. So I went on and did a bachelor's degree in geosciences in Munich. And at the end of that time, I thought, actually, you know what, I always wanted to go overseas, and I didn't get around to it while I was in high school. So why don't I do it now? So I moved all the way to the other side of the world, to New Zealand, and did a master's degree. So I did more research, and in that master's degree, I was meant to do one project, but that project didn't get any money from the university to go through, and there was a different project, and that project was on earthquakes and volcanoes. So I thought, that sounds really interesting, I'll just do that. And I did that project, and I thought, actually, volcanoes, I love it. They're super interesting. They're, you know, in really fun places. So if you get to travel, you get to do some field work. And I thought, you know, much to my mum's dismay, because she thought I was going to come back to Germany after 2 years, I went on to Canada and I did my PhD there. It was 5 years. And again, did a lot more research on these sort of volcanic earthquakes, and particularly a type of earthquake that happens normally just before or during volcanic eruptions. So there's always this holy grail in volcanology of eruption forecasting. And can we say at this volcano it's going to erupt tomorrow? And I can tell you that probably we're never going to get to that point, but we can understand them a lot more. And so I was contributing a very, very small piece to that kind of work. And at the end of, or during my PhD, I met who's now my husband, and he lived in the UK. So that wasn't great because I lived in Canada. So eventually I moved to the UK, and he got a job in Cornwall. And so we moved to Cornwall, and I met some people. Among one of them was the CEO of the Earth Station where I worked at. And we got talking about various things, and he basically offered me a job. And so I took the job, and this is how I got in the space sector. So it was just complete coincidence. I was volunteering at the time, and through this volunteering we met. So again, just a pitch to sort of take opportunities, even if you can't necessarily see immediately that it's going to get you employment or something, but you might still get something out of it. And then again, I had a kid, and I had another kid, and I was on maternity leave with the second one, and I was just browsing online, and I saw this job with Space Tech Partners I'm in now, and I thought, it sounds really interesting. And I really liked my job at Hilly, but I thought it sounds like such a good challenge, and go into consulting and do lots of different projects, not just work on one thing. And I applied and I got the job. And then I had to tell them that actually I can't move to Munich because the company is based in Munich. And for a while I thought we were going to go there, but we couldn't. And they said, don't worry, you can work for us remotely and we'll figure it out. So again, it's just, you know, coincidences, but always just doing what feels right at the time and the things that you're really interested in. Because if you do something that you're not interested in, you're probably not going to be that good at it. And then it's not going to lead to anything. So just follow your passions. And if you don't know exactly what they are, just try to think of some things that you like, even if you don't necessarily think it's the best thing in the world, and it might lead to something fun.
Thank you. I think that's such good advice. So, you know, I think there's hardly anybody who at the age of sort of 40, 50, 60, 17, if you met them again when they were 45, you know, they're doing that thing that they said back then that they wanted to do. And yet so many of them are doing things they absolutely love. But it's because they've stepping stoned through things they've enjoyed. So exactly as you just said, one of the things that I feel as though all of you has sort of mentioned is this idea of taking experiences. So Yvonne mentioned that you really wanted to do medicine, you know, you really enjoyed that was what you're thinking of. And then as soon as you did some lab work, you're like, oh no, I love this actually. And it was through the experience of having a go at something that you recognize what you really love. So one of the things that I think all of you have said is about taking those experiences and opportunities. Something else that occurred to me is you know, that there does seem to be quite a lot of flexibility in the sorts of careers that all of the panelists have had. So for example, a lot of travel. Kat, for you, able to go and use your skills in lots of different places. Emily, I don't know where your next role doing meteorology might be, but presumably there's a need for that all over the globe. So lots of options there. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. So what I'm going to do in the final few minutes is just to ask you, so the advice is for girls interested in pursuing science, but I guess we could also put it as, you know, advice for your younger self. What would you have told yourself? And I feel like we've already sort of said, you know, follow your passions, be brave and take chances. But I wonder if each of you could sort of just give some advice to the girls who are watching about if they think that actually a science career or career in research might be for them. What would you advise them to do? Yvonne first, please.
Okay, so I think one of the most important things is having contacts. So do not be afraid to make contacts. So if you see and you are interested in something, even if you're not 100% sure, find a way, send an email to, it could be a professor or anybody that you think maybe is involved in that particular area that you're interested in. Just ask and say, let's have a chat, because in many cases, that's what brings those opportunities and experiences that will make you either affirm and say, I really love doing this, or maybe it's not what I want. So currently, for example, there are opportunities like for in like visiting, for example, universities or research institutions, maybe sometimes on a one-day placement, work experience, or something where you actually can be able to experience and see whether it's for you. That'd be my advice.
I think that's fantastic advice, and actually I think Kat gave an example of that. Of you contacted somebody who ran the course, and you got their kind of inside track on this is what it's like, this is what, you know, and you can find out about it. I definitely agree. That idea of kind of having a network and starting to build contacts and being brave about reaching out and saying, I'm really interested in this, you know, could we possibly, you know, talk, could I visit? Absolutely. And, you know, as being a person, and I'm sure all of us on the panel are, a person who's sometimes on the receiving end of those sorts of emails, I am always thrilled if someone reaches out and says, hey, I'm interested in this. Is there anyone you could know who could help? Or I'm really looking for some work experience in this area. Because people who are involved in sort of these fields, we want to help, we want more people engaged. So anyone watching, you know, if there are people you think, oh, that would be, I really wish I was brave enough to contact them or send them an email, or they probably don't want to hear from me, you know, the worst that can happen is they ignore your email, you know, and the best that can happen is you get some incredible piece of experience. So do go ahead and do that. Thank you, that's really useful advice, Yvonne. Emily, so what about you? So what advice would you give to the girls watching about getting into a STEM career?
I'd say, first of all, don't get deterred if you're the only girl in the room, because when I was at school, I was the only girl in my class doing physics at the time, which might not be as much of the case anymore, but we were still in the minority, particularly in physics. And like, science subjects are difficult, and if you do find them difficult but you find them interesting and work hard at them, you can definitely still like pave a career in science for sure. So yeah, and also getting work experience, I find, is like another great way of making sure that you enjoy the area that you're interested in, just to kind of gain lots of different experiences in different like science fields, I guess.
Great, thank you. Absolutely, that getting good work experience in a relevant area, that links so closely to the one about, you know, do reach out to people who might be able to help. The other thing, something Kat you said earlier, was around, you know, you volunteered first and then you had an opportunity for a job. That really often happens, that once you are kind of involved in some way, it makes it much more likely that you'll be aware of the opportunities around you. So I totally agree about that as well. So Kat, your advice to young researchers, what would you say?
I can only second what the other two have said and what you said, because those are points that I always mention. The only last thing I would add, and please forgive my language, but don't take any from people. basically, there are lots of people out there who still follow these old, outdated stereotypes, and who, you know, who will say things like, "Oh, girls, they don't belong in science. They don't, you know, they don't know how to do this. They don't belong here." And it's absolutely not true. And you can show them otherwise. We had an old professor in one of my classes in my undergrad, in a class called Theoretical Mechanics, which was quite dry if you ask me, but some people might find it really interesting. And there were 2 of us girls and 4 guys in it, and every time one of us girls had to, you know, do some maths on the blackboard or something, the professor would make some snarky comments. And in the end, I worked really hard, and I, along with one of the other guys, we got the best grade at the end of that class. And at that point, the professor didn't really know what to say anymore. So just show them what you're capable of, because you know what that is and they don't. So you just need to show it to them and prove them wrong.
Excellent, thank you. So I was just thinking about how I'm going to summarize this later. I'll probably miss out that particular word, but absolutely show people what you're made of, and don't let other people decide what you're able to do, because actually you're all going to be capable of really fantastic things. Now we are at the end of the time, unless anyone's got a burning question they would like to ask. I can't see one typed into the chat box, so I think all that remains is to say an enormous thank you to all the panelists. Thank you so much for coming. And for schools, you know, through Iris is one of the ways that you can reach out. So if you would, if you do want to reach out to any of these panelists here, do drop Iris an email, and we're happy to pass messages on and things like that, or questions. But otherwise, just remains to say an enormous thank you to all the panelists, and thank you very much to the students and staff who've come along. Thanks very much.